Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Michigan and to Hutchins Hall at the University of Michigan Law School. I'm Steve Ratner. I'm the director of the Donia Human Rights Center, and that's all you'll see of my mouth for the next hour and a half. It's a great pleasure to start our academic year and our semester and our speaker series for the year. We're very excited about a great lineup of speakers and challenging topics throughout the academic year. I just want to briefly acknowledge the benefactor of the center, Bob and Jane Donia, who are sitting right over there. Bob and Jane, thank you for your generosity that makes all of this possible. We greatly appreciate it. We are doing this event in an unusual hybrid format because I really wanted to have the opportunity to welcome people back to a live in-person session, and we have a nice crowd here in the law school room. But this is technologically a challenge, and so I ask for your forgiveness if we lose some kind of audio or video at some point. Fortunately, we have Justin from the University of Michigan Law School IT department, one of our phenomenal administrators, to help out when there are glitches or if there are glitches. So I hope there aren't any, but we're going to try this format today. Okay, so the last week has been marked in both the United States and abroad with commemorations of the events of September 11th, 2001. Along with documentaries and interviews, we've seen debates by citizens, academics, public officials in the print media, TV, and other formats about the long-term legacy, so to speak, of that awful day. Most of the conversation has addressed two effects of 9/11. First, on U.S. foreign policy and world events somehow connected with 9/11. The U.S. led war in Afghanistan, which ended last month, the invasion of Iraq, the relationships with allies, and secondly, the other topic that's been addressed is the legacy of 9/11 for American politics and society. As the conventional wisdom would have it, how did we move from a time of unity to a time of a sharp division? What did 9/11 do to create or contribute to the political morass and dysfunction that we now experience? Our focus today is quite different from these two, but it's equally important, and it's one that flows from the mission of the Donia Center, which is to examine the legacy of 9/11 for the protection and enjoyment of human rights worldwide. With our esteemed group of speakers, we hope to look at this issue from multiple perspectives, going beyond sound bites and op-eds and pushing against the conventional wisdom. In particular, we're going to examine three aspects. First, the legacy of 9/11 for the human rights of the victims of terrorism. How, if at all, did 9/11 change the way that transnational non-state actors deploy violence against civilians? How did it affect the rights of innocent people to be protected from such violence and achieve a remedy or accountability should it happen? Secondly, we will look at the legacy of 9/11 regarding governmental action globally taken in the name of counterterrorism. How has governmental policy changed since 9/11, and how has it affected human rights? Has global cooperation led to improvement or worsening of human rights? And thirdly, we will turn to the United States and ask that same question, because the US has asserted itself as in a leadership role in counterterrorism policy and action. How has the US approach to terrorism and counterterrorism since 9/11 affected the enjoyment of human rights, both in the United States and globally? To explore these three questions, we are very lucky to be joined by three leading experts. Professor Karima Bennoune of the University of California, Davis, and joining us from New York, where she's attending meetings of the United Nations, Professor Fionnuala Nyalane of the University of Minnesota and the Queen's University, Belfast, and joining us from Washington, Andrea Prasso, Deputy Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Each of our three panelists, whom I'll introduce separately, will speak for between 12 and 15 minutes. Then I'll pose some immediate questions to them, and then we will hear from the audience, both those of you in the room and those over Zoom who can submit your questions using the Q&A function. I have a computer here, so I'll be able to see the questions that those of you in Zoom land pose to us over the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat function. I'm not even sure whether you can. Just use the Q&A function. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Karima Bennoune. Karima holds the Homer Angelo and Ann Beryl Endowed Chair in International Law and is Martin Luther King Professor of Law at the University of California, Davis School of Law. And most importantly, for my purposes, she is currently a visiting professor at the University of Michigan Law School this semester, and our students are very lucky to be learning from her. For the last 6 years, she has been serving as the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, a mandate given to her by the United Nations Human Rights Council. In 2017, she served as an expert in the Al-Mahdi case before the International Criminal Court concerning the destruction of cultural heritage in Mali. A former legal advisor for Amnesty International, her field work has included Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cyprus, Egypt, Lebanon, Mali, Malaysia, Maldives, Niger, Poland, Serbia, Thailand, Tunisia, Tuvalu, and other places. Her book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, Untold Stories from the Fight Against Muslim Fundamentalism, recounts the stories of people of Muslim heritage working against extremism, and her TED Talk based on the book has been viewed by over 1.5 million people. The great envy of other academics. Professor Bennoune also serves on the Scholarly Advisory Board for Muslims for Progressive Values. Karima, it's delightful to have you here, so we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here in the room and in cyberspace. I'm truly honored to be taking part in this important event, and I thank Professor Ratner and the Donia Center for including me. What I'm going to do in my time is describe what I see as a few key lessons in the field of human rights that we should draw from the atrocities of September 11th of 2001. Lessons I think that are important to remember going forward from Saturday's somber 20th anniversary. The specific task I have been given is to focus on the situation of victims of terrorism, and my remarks need to be understood together with those of the other speakers who are addressing other important facets of this issue. My first point concerns the importance of thoroughly addressing the rights of victims of terrorism in any meaningful human rights analysis of the impact of 9/11 and the significance of its 20th anniversary. This includes their rights to life, to reparation, and to justice. And it may sound like an obvious point, but I think it is an aspect of the discussion all too often left out, unfortunately. In human rights terms, the 9/11 attacks, like other mass casualty terrorist attacks, represented grave violations of fundamental human rights norms. The widespread targeting and deliberate murder of civilians was nothing less than a crime against humanity, a systematic attack against a civilian population with knowledge of the attack, for which accountability was essential. As a human rights lawyer, my starting point is with the victims of that terrible day. Those victims include those killed and injured, but also their families and rescue workers and others who became ill later. We know that 2,977 people from 93 countries around the world were killed immediately in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. They ranged in age from 2 to 85 years old. Deaths from 9/11 related illnesses now actually outnumber those immediate losses, with more than 18,000 being reported by the CDC to have been diagnosed with 9/11 related cancer. Unfortunately, that's especially common among first responders, and the death toll continues to rise. They should collectively be understood as victims of the 9/11 attacks. Provision for medical care for those who became ill as a result of the attacks was extended through the Victims' Compensation Fund Permanent Authorization Act. But I should stress that this was not automatic, which we might have assumed it to be, and only occurred because of advocacy, sustained advocacy by victims groups with support from prominent people like the comedian Jon Stewart. The process of reading the names that we saw on Saturday is such an important one, and I don't know if anyone else was annoyed when the networks continuously interrupted it with the views of pundits. I really wanted to focus on the names, because it allows us to remember that diverse quality of humanity, that diverse quilt of humanity whose lives were claimed by the attacks, names from every region of the world. Just to mention a few of them, I think of Father Michael Judge, a Franciscan priest who was a New York Fire Department chaplain and died in the lobby of Tower 1. Rushing to comfort victims of terror, he became one of them. I also think about Aminia Prasso, a Guyanan American Muslim woman who worked as an accountant on the 95th floor of the World Trade Center and never made it out of the building. Her life challenged simple narratives about what it means to be a Muslim woman in America. Going forward, I hope we will honor the memories of Ms. Rasool and Father Mike and all the other victims by responding to this anniversary going forward in a thoughtful and complicated way, by challenging diverse extremisms and discrimination, all in a manner which can lead to enhanced human rights protection. For many focused on security and some on the right of the political spectrum, it is primarily the events of September 11th which are commemorated rather than tragic aspects of the aftermath. However, for some on the left of the political spectrum, and sometimes in the world of human rights, it sometimes seems as if consideration begins on September 12th, in other words, with the flawed response. I would argue that a holistic human rights approach requires us to be concerned both about the impacts of the attacks themselves, as well as the impacts of some of the responses to them that violated international law, including by being discriminatory, and my fellow speakers will be addressing the latter today. It is only when one takes all of those aspects together that one can begin to appreciate the totality of these multi-directional threats to human rights. The reality that governments have grossly abused human rights in the name of fighting terrorism does not make that fight any less important. It simply means that we have to combat several forms of suffering simultaneously, rather than tolerating either one in the name of the other. So much work in the area of rights-based prevention of terrorism remains outstanding and unfunded, including supporting initiatives in the fields of arts, culture, and education to counter extremism, including effective law-abiding responses to incitement, and including thoughtful, constructive support to those speaking out against terrorism and its perpetrators. In the first talk that I gave after 9/11, which was actually here at the law school, I argued that in human rights terms, we faced a terrible dilemma. Could we respond to the horror which descended upon New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania at the hands of al-Qaeda terrorists in a way which effectively prevented the recurrence of similar atrocities, which correctly identified and punished the perpetrators of those terrible events, or at least those who were still alive, and which response at the same time still did not violate fundamental human rights norms? Could governments respect and ensure human rights? Finding such a balanced approach is the least that the international community owed to victims and continues to owe to them going forward. And I think today we will assess whether or not we were able to live up to that, meeting the challenge of that terrible dilemma identified in 2001. I fear that the answer is no, although there are some positive glimmers of hope that one must point to as well. I have done many interviews with victims and survivors of terrorism in many countries over the years. I think it is difficult to comprehend the level of the anguish involved for families who are really also victims, but their words can help us to try to understand their experience. For example, I think of the head of one victims group in North Africa who lost her brother and sister to a terror attack. When I asked her how she survived, she replied, "Survived, I don't know if I did survive. A part of you leaves with them. I was not whole for years. It was a pain I would not wish on anyone." While human rights advocates need to and have engaged with victims of counter-terrorism that has violated international law, they must also engage with such victims of terrorism who have often expressed to me their frustration with being overlooked by some human rights advocates, and have stressed that what they were seeking was justice, not violations of human rights. I agree with a report prepared by a former UN Special Rapporteur on protecting human rights while countering terrorism, Ben Emerson, on the need for the recognition of the rights of victims of terrorism in normative frameworks, and the need to recognize them as victims regardless of the issue of state responsibility. He praised a particular law in Spain on the recognition and integral protection of the victims of acts of terrorism from 2011, which created a unified scheme setting out the assistance, support, and protection to which victims are entitled. and expressly recognizing victims of terrorism as victims of human rights violations. This is an example of a positive development in the last 20 years, responding to the horror of mass casualty terrorism. But much more needs to be done in this regard because these victims have had little attention to their rights and even less justice. But I have to also stress on the positive side, it has been a very good thing to see some of the UN initiatives trying to give victims of terrorism from around the world a voice at the global level, trying to provide them with resources to support their work. One example is the recent drafting by the UN's Counter-terrorism Center of a handbook of good practices to support victims associations in Africa and the Middle East, a publication that very importantly was constructed on the basis of a consultation process, bringing victims of terrorism from many different regions of the world together, to work together and share their experiences. The handbook covers a wide range of important topics, from best practice on working with victims of particular kinds of violence by terrorist groups, such as sexual violence, to the need to raise victims' voices and ideas for how to do that. The UN's global counterterrorism strategy began to carve out a place for victims by acknowledging the lack of support they have received and their increasing marginalization, as well as really underscoring the importance of promoting, respecting, and protecting victims' rights. However, too often their suffering is invoked by others when convenient, but their own voices remain unheard and their needs and rights unmet, and that must change. 9/11 drew global attention to victims of terrorism, which is a positive result of terrible events, but that attention has still been insufficient and inconsistent. This brings me to my second point, the inconsistency in particular. My second point, which is to stress that we need to pay attention to victims of terrorism globally, and in particular to victims in Muslim majority countries and other countries in the global south who have been amongst the most numerous victims of jihadist groups, such as those that perpetrated 9/11. The attackers on 9/11 we know were Al-Qaeda members, fundamentalist extremists purveying a nihilistic ideology, which is itself a grave threat to human rights values, and especially so in Muslim majority contexts. And these groups have killed thousands from Algeria to Iraq and beyond. My father, who was an Algerian anthropologist and a professor at the University of Algiers, who along with many others resisted the violence of jihadist groups in his own country before 9/11, at a time when the world was not paying a great deal of attention to this threat, Bennoune, he wrote that the ideology of jihadist groups represents, quote, a negation of reason and democracy, of common sense, and of Islamic, humanist, and universal values. In other words, these groups pose threats not only to security, but also to human rights, and those threats are interlinked. And I think we need to do more to learn from the analysis of those on the front lines. We have not heeded it, we have not heard their voices. Many people assume that people of Muslim heritage and Muslims enter this discussion only when we come to discuss victims of counter-terrorist abuses, or when we talk about those who have been mistaken for terrorist suspects. And certainly there are very important aspects of those discussions to consider when addressing the situation of Muslims and people of Muslim heritage. However, they have been among the first to warn of the danger of this terrorism and the ideology which underpins it, though their voices have not been heeded. And they have been among the largest numbers of victims of terrorism by jihadist groups in the years since 9/11. And just to give one example, during Ramadan 2012, just during that one month of Ramadan, Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for 131 attacks in Iraq, killing 400 people. Those casualties are too often reduced at the international level to a sort of third world body count, statistics without a name or a face. And this is truly unacceptable. I think of some of them. I think of the Pakistani religious scholar, Mufti Safraz Naimi from the Barelvi School, who chaired a meeting of Islamic religious scholars that denounced suicide terrorism in 2009. He said those who commit suicide attacks for attaining paradise will go to hell as they kill many innocent people. Later that year, he was himself targeted by just such a Taliban bomber and killed after Friday prayers. So I think it's very important to make clear that this kind of violence did not commence on September 11th, 2001, but long before, and it has continued since with terrible and overlooked recent attacks from Burkina Faso to Mozambique and beyond. Much more needs to be done to support people of Muslim heritage who have been at the forefront of trying to prevent and stop it. And just to give one example, I laud the organization that I have the honor to sit on the board of, which is Muslims for Progressive Values, that not only tackles anti-Muslim hatred and discrimination in the West, which became all too common after 9/11, but also takes on the problem of the misuse of religion to support extremist agendas, and often does this with other partners working in other faith traditions, such as Hindus for Human Rights. Muslims for Progressive Values is currently involved in calling out Muslim clerics that have expressed support for the Taliban takeover of power in Afghanistan. And their multi-directional approach that is both working against discrimination against Muslims and challenging Muslim extremists, I think is not given adequate recognition and is critically important going forward from this 20th anniversary. And my time is running out. The final point I want to make is how essential it is to think about the role of the situation in Afghanistan in how we respond to the lessons from 9/11 going forward, and whether we tragically are going to have to learn those lessons all over again, which I hope will not be the case. I fear that the current situation on the ground, created by a range of actors, including successive administrations in the United States, may condemn both Afghans and Americans and others to future 9/11s. And so for me, the key takeaway there again is how interlinked human rights and security are, how closely related the issue of human rights for Afghans and safety and security for people in the United States, in fact, are. And I would like to have thought that we learned that lesson in a very tragic way in 2001. And Maya Angelou reminded us that we can't unlive history, but if we face it with courage, it need not be lived again. So let's try to do that at this 20th anniversary. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karima, for getting us started and for those remarks and for also respecting the time constraints we're under. Our second speaker is Professor Fionnuala Ní Fhlatharraigh. She's Regents Professor and Rabina Professor of Law, Public Policy, and Society at the University of Minnesota Law School. And she's Professor of Law at Queen's University, Belfast. Since 2017, she has been the UN Special Rapporteur on the protection and promotion of human rights while countering terrorism. So we have two UN Special Rapporteurs here today. Professor Ní Fhlatharraigh is the recipient of numerous academic awards, including the Lieberman Fellowship, the British Academy Awards, the Fulbright, the Allon Prize, and the Robert Schuman Scholarship. She's an elected fellow of the Royal Irish Academy as well. And she's published extensively regarding emergency powers, counterterrorism and human rights, conflict regulation, transitional justice, and sex-based violence in times of war. So she was an ideal choice of the Human Rights Council for her position. Her book, Law in Times of Crisis, was awarded the ASI, American Society of International Law's Certificate of Merit for the best book of the year that it was published. So Fionnuala from New York, we are delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be joining you, particularly glad to be joining my colleague and friend Karima. We've done a great deal of work together. And so thanks to Stephen Ratner for the invitation and to Donia Center for making this conversation happen. So I'm really going to speak from the institutional perch I hold, which is the role of UN Special Rapporteur, but also in part infused by having lived and grown up in a violent society, that of Northern Ireland, where the overlay of conflict, terrorism, counterterrorism, and human rights really shaped the lawyer I am and the scholar that I am. When 9/11 happened, I was actually in hospital. I had just given birth to my eldest son. And so the images that I have of that gray ash-filled day are also very images that involved holding a small baby and at the start of the world feeling like it was very complex, both the joy of motherhood and the challenge of seeing the world as you knew it unfold and change before you. I think it's really important as we think across the 9/11 legacy. I want to really focus on three things: the global institutional legacy of 9/11, the normative legacy of 9/11. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact on civil society, in particular from 9/11, and the current security legacies that were birthed by that day. So let me start by talking about the institutional legacies. For many of us who had worked on terrorism and counterterrorism before 9/11, we were often relegated to the footnotes of constitutional law books or to small places in the world that were particularly difficult, like Belfast. But it was never seen as fundamental to the understanding of the legal, or terrorism and violence weren't seen as fundamental to the understanding of either the global legal order or in particular the shaping of national dialogue. And of course, 9/11 changed all that. And one of the things that was clearly birthed out of 9/11 was an extraordinary global architecture of counterterrorism. That started in the month after the events of 9/11, the Security Council passing a series of resolutions that not only rightly condemned the violence that had taken place, but created a set of new architectures, both within and without the UN system. At the very beginning, that included under UN Security Council Resolution 1373, whose anniversary was just Monday of this week, we saw the creation of the UN Counter-terrorism Committee, a committee that sits just below the Security Council and for many observers of the UN is actually invisible. We look at the UN Security Council, we see dysfunction, we see a lack of agreement, we see things not done. But if you just peep a little bit below that and what's been happening in the past 20 years, what we see is a space of extraordinary unanimity and an extraordinary aggrandizement of political and legal power, and a really significant effect on the normative content of international law as a result. Talk a little more about that. In addition to this global counterterrorism, the Counterterrorism Committee, it's serviced by a permanent civil service, a special political mission, UNCTED, which functions again as a specialist arm of the Security Council, in many ways moving the kind of dialogue on the Council on counterterrorism into action, technical support, capacity building at the national level. On the General Assembly side of the House, we also had an extraordinary expansion of counterterrorism architecture. And today that is constituted as the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, made up of 43 UN entities, of which the mandate I hold is one, but also which includes an Office of Counterterrorism. And again, interesting to note, just as so many other parts of the UN have been cut back and underfunded and under-budgeted, that has not been the case for counterterrorism at the UN. Counterterrorism is growing, and I tell my students it's like a Pac-Man. It's eating up everything around it, moving into development, moving into education, moving into a whole range of areas that one would never imagine to be sort of driven by security imperatives. It's probably important to know that the UN counterterrorism architecture is funded by two states, and most people wouldn't guess who they are. They're the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Kingdom of Qatar. So that might tell you something about the priorities, imperatives, and values of the counterterrorism architecture. It would state the obvious to say that that counterterrorism architecture is either human rights light or human rights absent. Jeremy Greenstock, who was the British ambassador to the Security Council at 9/11, in the months after the establishment of the Counterterrorism Committee, made clear that human rights had no place in this architecture, that it wasn't wanted, that security was one thing and human rights were another thing, and this space was about advancing security. The result, of course, has been fairly disastrous for human rights, and we'll talk about that, but in a circular way, picking up on Karima's last note, has also been profoundly destabilizing for security. And in addition to that massive architecture within the UN, we saw a growth of all kinds of, if you want, hybrid and outsourced human rights entities growing up around the world, if you want. Some of those we know already. The regional bodies like the EU and the Inter-American System establish specialized offices or structures of counterterrorism enforcement. But when states couldn't get what they wanted in those traditional UN or regional body structures, they created their own. And a good example of that is the Global Counterterrorism Forum, a self-selected club of states established essentially to do a kind of a walk around UN norms. If you couldn't get the norms you wanted in the UN system, you went and you outsourced them to development in the Global Counterterrorism Forum with a group of friendly states who would then push those norms back into the UN system, primarily through the use of UN Security Council resolutions. We've also seen other bodies like the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the most important international law body nobody's ever heard of, which has become critical to the regulation of markets and banking and financial sector, again, largely driven and repurposed after 9/11 to do counterterrorism work. That institutional architecture, again, is just to underscore, it is a space in which human rights has very little play. Human rights actors have very little room to breathe. And when we show up, we're usually an unwanted guest at the table. We arrive usually invited at the end of a process where we point out that the human rights standards haven't been well enforced or even addressed at all. And then it's as if we're making life difficult for everyone, or we're just not with the program because we're not understanding what states are up to, which is really driving a space of security and conflict regulation that has very little to do with rights. So let me step out of the architecture and speak a little bit to the normative content of the post 9/11 landscape. Well, the first and most important thing is, of course, that after 9/11, in the architecture that was built and the norms that it produced, there is no agreed definition of terrorism. And in some ways, this is the mother problem, or the mother of all problems, which is that absent that agreement on a definition of terrorism, states, in fact, get to define whomever they want as a terrorist. And the result of that has been the perfect gentleman's agreement at the Security Council, where everyone has agreed about the need to regulate terrorism, but nobody wants to name or curtail what it might mean. And so the result is that we've seen an explosion of what I have called supranational legislative practice by the Security Council, where Security Council resolutions have become the normative superhighway for pushing through legal norms. If you look closely at the international sort of landscape in counterterrorism in the last few years, we've had almost no treaties. And there's a good reason for that. States don't need treaties anymore. They can get more or less what they want through Security Council resolutions and soft lawmaking. And so this normative structure where nobody ever calls anybody else out on their definition of terrorism means that what we're seeing, in my view, is an epidemic of the misuse of counterterrorism across the globe. We see it in countries like Egypt, where in fact most of civil society is either left incarcerated or under some form of restraint, because all of that work is considered to be, all of that human rights work is considered to be terrorism. We've seen it in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where women drivers advocating for the right to drive cars have been defined as terrorists and processed through the special criminal terrorist courts. We see it in countries like Turkey, where civil society, lawyers, judges, university professors are being defined as terrorists and prosecuted in that way. And maybe most obviously and egregiously, we see the example of Xinjiang, China, where in fact an entire minority population has been defined as a threat to the state, and the regulatory framework which allows China to do what it does is a counterterrorism framework. All of that to say that the misuse and abuse of these normative frameworks is one of the legacies of 9/11. It's concretely related to the permissive space that was created after 9/11, in which everyone agreed that terrorism was a threat, but they subcontracted the regulation of it to states with no meaningful oversight. In the entirety of the global counterterrorism architecture, the only entity charged with the oversight of counterterrorism is the Counterterrorism and Human Rights Special Rapporteur, who's a part-time expert with none of the resources necessary to do the work that it would be required, in fact, to restrain the excessive abuses we see. Let me just say a little bit about targeting, 2 more points to say something about the targeting of civil society. The mandate I hold has been really clear that one of the most egregious outworkings of the permissive global environment that we've created in counterterrorism has been the systematic targeting of civil society. And that includes, and I am picking up here on Karina's point about victims associations, that includes directly targeting those who are representing those who have been harmed by terrorism. And so the scale of this abuse was, the mandate I hold, we did a measurement a couple of years ago where we took all of the communications that had been sent to all mandate holders between 2005 and 2019. And we found that 66% of every single of measures used by governments under the banner of counterterrorism were targeted at a civil society actor. So that tells us 2 things. It tells us that states are doing lousy counterterrorism because actually there are real threats to be counted in real time, but those are not the threats that are being used and targeted by states. And rather what we see is the use of counterterrorism as the perfect cover for the quelling of dissent, the limitation on freedom of speech, the limitation on the freedom to practice one's religious belief and opinion, the right to assemble, and the right to engage in public affairs. Finally, let me just sort of comment by saying 2 things. One is that as we see a retreat in a way from counterterrorism by the US towards great power play, let's be clear that the lessons of US practice have been well learned by their adversaries, which is to say that this playbook of counterterrorism is one that's playing out in multiple parts of the globe, facilitated and enabled by this global sympathetic architecture. And so authoritarianism has learned that its friend is counterterrorism, its friend is securitization. Democracies who are, let's say, breathing lightly on the democracy front have also learned that counterterrorism is their friend. And we've seen extraordinary limitations on the practice of human rights by many advanced democracies. I include in those many European democracies who certainly have experienced the challenge of terrorism, but who have in fact have not learned the lesson that by targeting those communities, Muslim communities and others, that they are not making themselves more safe or more secure. And I, like Karima, close on the image of Afghanistan. I close by reminding us that the Taliban remains a UN, or many of the members of the Taliban, in fact, the majority of the government, except for 2 individuals, are on UN designated terrorist lists. So here we are 20 years later. What have we learned in the meantime? I think we've learned a couple of things. One is that the war on terror was not won. In fact, it was clearly lost if we take it in the framework in which it was presented. But more than that, the mismanagement of that war, the sidelining of human rights, the misuse of the great power of states, including the systematic drone targeting in Afghanistan and Pakistan over decades, have reaped its rewards in further creating the conditions conducive to violence and enabling and sustaining the oxygen upon which these groups breathe. I, like Karima, think that this is a moment of fundamental pause and rethink. If we have not learned that what we did for 20 years didn't work, we will never learn it. And so now is the moment when we have to rethink it all and start again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala, for those remarks. A wonderful contribution to our discussion, and we look forward to coming back to discussing them. Our third panelist is Andrea Prasso, who is the Deputy Washington Director at Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading human rights NGOs. In that position, she conducts advocacy before the US government on global human rights issues. with a particular focus on national security and foreign policy. She frequently appears on domestic and international radio and TV, and is published in many print and online media outlets like Politico, The Hill, Foreign Policy Magazine. Prior to joining HRW, she was the defense attorney in the Office of Military Commissions in the U.S. Department of Defense and was an assistant counsel for Salim Hamdan in the only contested military commission trial to date. Prior to that, she worked as an associate at a New York law firm where she served as habeas counsel for 10 Saudi detainees at Guantanamo. So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's really great to be here. And I want to thank Professor Ratner, not only for having us, but for hosting an all-female panel, which I really appreciate. In the national security circles in which I run in Washington, there remain a dearth of female voices. There's not a dearth of women working on these issues. So thank you for that. I really like speaking to law students and at law schools about post 9/11 issues, in part because I was a law student on 9/11. I had just started my second year at Georgetown University Law Center, and the world that I knew changed, as it did for some of you. I know there are some younger people in the audience as well, but also the entire career path that I pursued didn't exist at the time. As we've heard, the people working on counterterrorism were somewhat marginalized. The notion of national security law was really about nuclear threats. And of course, many of us know there were the people in the US government who were very focused on the counterterrorism threat and all of the errors that led to the lack of information that was shared leading up to 9/11. But what really changed, so today is September 14th, and of course we've all observed the commemoration of the 20-year anniversary of the attacks, which was on September 11th. But 20 years ago today, Congress voted to authorize the use of military force, an authorization which was signed by the president on September 18th, the more common anniversary if you track these dates. But September 14th is the day that Congress passed the joint resolution. And it's not the attacks, in my view, that changed the world. It was the response led by the United States. So it's fitting that we're having this conversation here today. I tried to divide up the last 20 years in a series of periods, and I started with an early phase and a middle phase, and then I had a first phase and a second phase. I've given up on the nomenclature. I'm just going to talk about the different things I've seen, and hopefully it will all make sense. And I'm going to focus primarily on the US. Of course, a great deal of the US counterterrorism response has taken place outside of US borders, but a lot of it has occurred inside the US as well, and I'm going to touch on both. But what I think is most important to note and is tied to the anniversary today is that the immediate US response and global response, for that matter, was fear-based. We saw domestic fear-mongering. Many of you might have seen that in addition to commemorating the victims of 9/11, there was a sort of social media push to commemorate the first victim of an attack, someone identified by the public as an alleged terrorist and killed in the days after 9/11. The war was deemed by then President Bush as a crusade. We were told that countries were either with us being the US, or against us. There were roundups of Muslims, Arabs, South Asians held on material witness warrants. This early period, which was driven by fear, really set the stage for what we saw over the later years and what we see today. I think it's important to understand that it was rooted in fear, which helped prompt some of the extreme nature of it. And when one tries to disentangle it now, it can be hard to figure out sort of the logical threads. So in the years following 9/11, weeks following 9/11, the FBI was given a new mission. It was no longer just a law enforcement agency. It was also an intelligence gathering agency and a counterterrorism agency. That changed the way that the FBI behaved inside the United States. The AUMF, which I've already mentioned, was open-ended. It authorized armed conflict against the nations and persons responsible for the 9/11 attacks and those who harbored them. It did not identify al-Qaeda by name, which people often don't realize unless they actually read it. And it's been used by all of the successive administrations to justify their use of lethal force and detention against persons and groups affiliated with al-Qaeda and affiliated with a series of organizations, many of which did not exist in 2001, such as ISIS. Within a few weeks of the war, when there's armed conflict, hopefully, will be detention if not all the enemies are immediately killed. So within a few weeks, the US faced the detention problem. And that led to detention in the theater of war in Afghanistan, and also led to Guantanamo. So again, when I reflect back on the last 20 years, I remember being in my 2L year in the winter of 2002, studying international human rights law and seeing those first images of men arriving in Guantanamo in orange jumpsuits. At the time, I did not imagine my entire career would be shaped by that and involve representing some of them. But it was a really iconic moment. And I think it's important for, I guess I'm old enough now that I feel like if you haven't lived this, you don't really know what happened. But I think it is important for younger people who are only studying these experiences to understand the fear that people lived through and that we were told we should be experiencing. Again, fear is the thread here because it formed the basis of the US response. And it was also an important part, and quite frankly remains an important part of the messaging from the US government and from governments around the world. The reason that these policies and practices remain in place is because there is a constant story of how dangerous the threat of terrorism is, and that we must sacrifice human rights and civil liberties and constitutional rights because that threat is so dangerous. As you study this, as you learn more about it, you will realize that, well, of course, terrorism and terrorists pose a significant threat. I think in the last couple of years, many people have started to realize that there are many very serious threats that the world faces. Climate change is one, pandemic is another, and that the sacrifices that people have been asked to make in the name of countering terrorism were not appropriate. Of course, also illegal, but there are also questions about whether they were morally wise. So the early period characterized by fear, characterized by the use of military force, the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, the beginning of detention in Guantanamo, and of course by torture and secret detention, renditions, people being flown around the world to be held in secret CIA black sites for interrogation and torture, transferred to other countries for the same type of experience. This is particularly important when we get to the Iraq War, which was actually predicated on rendition and torture. One of the bases for the US and the UK initiating the Iraq War was information that was obtained from a detainee who was rendered to Egypt. He was sent to Egypt to be interrogated and tortured, where he falsely provided information alleging that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction and Al-Qaeda. That information was repeated at the UN and again used as a basis for the Iraq War. So the torture, which is at the root of a lot of the US counterterrorism response, had so many repercussions, including the entire Iraq War. Most of that is sort of what I tried to characterize as the early phase, which then, that was sort of the immediate, robust use of force response, the big actions on the international stage. Well, of course, at the same time, a great deal was happening at home. The next sort of middle phase, but I think we're going to have a couple middle phases here, was characterized more by surveillance. This is electronic surveillance, but also physical surveillance, particularly of American Muslim communities, by the use of drones, something we are starting to talk about again, but for a significant period weren't as much. So the significant use of drones. Domestically, what we saw was the use of entrapment, targeting American Muslims, Muslim communities being asked to, through the lens of countering violent extremism, being asked to look into their own communities as if they had some special access to would-be terrorists, because the notion was that within the American Muslim community, there were would-be terrorists and other Muslims would know how to find them, would hear them talk about their plans at mosques and so on, which really did a tremendous amount of damage to the American Muslim community. I think you probably will have seen a lot of statements from people who describe growing up in that environment, and really hope that you have a chance to think about that aspect as well, while also focusing on commemorating the victims of the actual attacks. This middle phase was also characterized by secrecy, a lack of transparency. There were dozens, hundreds of lawsuits filed by civil rights organizations and human rights organizations trying to access more information. Detainees gradually obtained the right to file lawsuits and obtain more information about the alleged bases behind their detention. But overarching, we had the tremendous release of information about surveillance by 2005. I suppose Edward Snowden's leak, all of this information sort of started to flood out. And I think at that phase, Americans were removed enough from the immediate response to 9/11 to step a little bit outside that fear response and start asking more questions. It was both the passage of time as well as, I think, individuals' sort of movement away from the immediate trauma of that period that allowed greater push towards transparency. Obama took office and we are still in the middle phase, only now I've called it the late middle phase because Obama said a lot of great things, like a pledge to close Guantanamo within 1 year, closing the CIA torture sites, which had already been closed or were empty anyway, even if they hadn't formally been closed. Yet the Obama period was characterized by a significant increase in the use of drone strikes, a sense that we were in a more intellectual removed phase of the war on terror, that it could be conducted from, from offices in Nevada, trailers in Nevada, that drone operators would be at a distance and US service members wouldn't be at harm's way, but that the US could still conduct this so-called war, but conduct it humanely. That was a theory, that's not my interpretation, to be clear. We also saw an increase of transparency in the Obama years, but not complete transparency. I think the Obama administration was committed to the concept of transparency, but not to actually implementing full transparency. Because of that, when we reached the Trump phase, what was so remarkable about the Trump years is that they weren't very different. So much of the counterterrorism architecture was simply a part of what people were used to. We've heard about the architecture happening in the international and the global community, and that, of course, was a huge part of it. But Americans had grown used to Guantanamo remaining open, despite pledges that it would be closed, had grown used to drone strikes, not reading about them on the cover of the New York Times anymore. But Trump, of course, pledged to end the war in Afghanistan, made some changes, for example, changes to the targeting rules when it comes to drone strikes. We saw less transparency than we'd seen before, but overall, counterterrorism under Trump was not vastly different from counterterrorism under Obama. Which really leads me to now, I won't name this period, it's certainly not the end, but I too want to end by talking briefly about Afghanistan, which is to note that what is notable about this period under this administration is also that so little has changed, that even as the president pledged to end US involvement in the war in Afghanistan, it was almost, it was expected and accepted that doing so would include the so-called over-the-horizon authorities, that once the US withdrew its military forces from Afghanistan, it would continue to and engage in a range of other methods of countering terrorism in Afghanistan. And it would do so in the same ways that it had conducted the war over the last 20 years. And I say that because the last strike in the so-called longest war in Kabul that many of you will have read about in the news was characterized by, as Secretary Blinken said today when he was testifying before the Senate, he did not know if the target was actually an aid worker or was a member of ISIS. And the senator questioning him said, wouldn't that be the sort of thing you would want to know before engaging in the strike? That's not the way that counterterrorism has been conducted by this government. It has never been essential to know who was at the other end of that drone. It has never been essential to know if or how many civilians were killed by a particular strike. And what we will see going forward as the US has ended its military involvement in terms of troops on the ground and bases in Afghanistan, is that notion that the US does not need to know the answers to these questions, but can continue to use force, detain people who are still in Guantanamo, who are still being prosecuted despite pledges to close it, and continue to treat people inside the US as potential threats, partners in countering the threat of terrorism, rather than just Americans who fear terrorism, as many others do, that those things that were born of the fear that so many people felt in the days and weeks following 9/11 are so deeply entrenched in the US government response that they cross political boundaries. They cross generations now, and they are likely virtually impossible to unravel. The challenge now for human rights advocates like myself, for people who want to change the system, is to think about what it would look like going forward in a way that is not what it looked like before. There is simply no return. I saw someone tweet, a journalist I follow tweet, saying, I wonder what 9/11 would have been like if we had smartphones. And I think about the fact that my dumb phone from the time didn't work, and I didn't have signal, and I used a payphone to call my parents to tell them that I was okay. We live in a fundamentally different world than we did 20 years ago, but many of you have grown up in that world, and it will be tremendously difficult to change it. So as I said, the challenge is to figure out what the new path going forward will be. What does it mean to counter terrorism? Should we even prioritize terrorism as a threat above all others when so many of us, I'm dialing in remotely because my youngest child isn't vaccinated yet, so I'm not ready to get on a plane and come see you in person. We live in a very, very different world than we did before. And the challenge for you is to figure out what that world should look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for those remarks, and also to all three of our panelists for, again, allowing us to still have time for some discussion, which we have about a half an hour or so for that. I want to sort of first encourage people who are watching remotely to use the Q&A function. I'll kind of alternate between the room and the Zoom space for passing on questions or for hearing questions. I want to just ask a couple myself to see whether you all agree on in your answers or have different views on this question. My first question for all three of you, and if you can keep your answers relatively brief so we have time for more, is there seemed to be a sort of assumption in all three of your remarks that 9/11 sort of changed. Maybe if it didn't change everything, it changed a whole lot of the way we think about, changed a whole lot from the perspective of the victims of terrorism and from the perspective of those affected by counterterrorism operations, whether domestically or overseas. And I guess I just wanted to push back against that a little bit and ask you whether you see continuities. Were there seeds for the kind of terrorism we saw on 9/11 and since 9/11 by groups before that? Were there seeds for the kind of counterterrorism policy that we've seen since 9/11 in the years before 9/11? And not just, spinning out some examples, but whether you can actually see any connections between those prior practices and where we are today. So if the three of you could just maybe take a crack at that. Karima first.
So thank you for this question. I think there were very important seeds to what we experienced on 9/11, and those were ignored. I think you have to go back and look again to Afghanistan and look at what happened during the illegal and very brutal Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is that the United States and some of its allies decided that jihadist groups would be a useful ally against the Soviet Union, against communism. And certainly, I think ending the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was important, but the enemy of my enemy is not my friend, and is certainly not the friend of the civilian population. And that sort of jihadist force that was unleashed, that was trained, that was financially supported, including by Pakistan, including by Saudi Arabia, in the context of sort of trying to drive the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. Then from there, we can really trace, I think, a very direct line to at 9/11. That's where we really see the birth of Al-Qaeda, and had a direct effect, for example, on Algeria, my father's home country, because the worst jihadist killers in the country we used to call the Afghans. When I first got to Afghanistan, people looked at me in horror and said, no, we call them the Arabs. So, it depends on, who you ask, but nevertheless, these were people who had gone and fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, and later in the war between the jihadist groups. And they then came home with their training and really unleashed horror from Morocco to Indonesia, but especially in certain countries like Algeria, which experienced something called the Dark Decade and lost about 100,000 people. And when Afghans and Algerians and some others in the 90s were trying to raise the fact that this was a very serious problem, not only were they not listened to, but some of the same arguments that you now hear used against Afghans were used against them. Oh, you're just the urban elite. You don't understand the rural people. Oh, this is happening because of failings in your own society, and therefore we're not very sympathetic. And I think what many of those who were speaking out in countries like Algeria and Afghanistan warned about was this is not a local problem. This, in fact, is going to become a global problem. And that's what we see on 9/11. And I think that is something people do not want to understand today about the situation in Afghanistan. And I understand that fear can be a very dangerous force, and the politics of fear can lead to some very bad places. But I'm also worried when people are not appropriately afraid. And I am surprised by some of the supporters of the current administration in this country who do not seem to be very afraid about the global impact of the situation in Afghanistan. I think there is very good reason to be afraid and to act appropriately on that basis in accordance with international law.
Fanula, same question with respect to continuities in either within the UN system or individual governments' policies regarding counterterrorism?
I mean, the place where I would certainly concede continuity is, I think, the problem and the dynamics of what produces the conditions conducive to terrorism are not different pre or post 9/11, but no one seems to have learned the fundamental understanding of what are the conditions on the ground which enable and sustain violence of this kind. So I suppose I would say I sometimes feel like I'm living in a loop, a Groundhog Day of Belfast circa 1987, because actually many of the things that we know about the production of violence, the overlay of terrorism with long-standing grievance, the lack of attention to development, to education. These are the things that those of us who've lived in deeply violent societies and have seen the resolution of violence through very slow and torturous and stop and start means understand very well. I think that's the same pre and post, I think. But I would push back on the institute. I think the architecture, the global architecture of counterterrorism is brand new. It is a 9/11 creature. And it has, as a result, created a space of permissibility, as I've said, both institutional and normative, which is entirely new. Pre 9/11, we did not have a series of essentially regulatory Security Council resolutions precisely defining how domestic legal systems should regulate on certain issues. That, to me, is brand new and also a really problematic use of Security Council practice, not just in the classic terms of sovereignty, but in the terms in which the production of international law, in my view, particularly normative content, should be a production of state engagement. And I think we've certainly lost that in the counterterrorism space, with enormous implications for security and peace and security more broadly. So that piece, I think, is completely new.
Thanks. And Andrea, within the United States government, continuities from policies before 9/11?
So, I think it's clear that human rights violations contribute to an environment that encourages terrorism. That is a centuries-old fact. And we have seen that because of the US government response, and we saw that before that. And there's also a reason that, round up the usual suspects is a great line, not just because it came from a great movie, but because that's what governments do. Something happens, they round up the usual suspects. That is also not new. But in my view, what is different is that the US evinced a belief following 9/11 that it had no constraints in the way it would respond. And then that was confirmed by an utter lack of restraint and lack of pushback from other governments. So of course, governments prior to 9/11 would do outrageous things, and the international community might be up in arms, and we could talk about whether international law has any effect or sort of how that would play itself out. But there was the notion that the things that the US did after 9/11 were not things that a government should do, certainly not a democracy should do. And that really disappeared for quite some time after 9/11. And even the states that would speak out against it and publicly would be in the back rooms, offering up their airspace for rendition flights or happily accepting intelligence obtained through abusive interrogation. So in my view, that's what's different. The US abusing human rights was not different. We can go back go back to the origin of the United States to talk about what the government was founded on. But the international system, I think, really broke down.
Okay, thanks. So I've got a couple of questions already coming in from our virtual audience, but I want to start with the room and offer the opportunity of any of our visitors here to start us out with some questions for any or all of the panelists. Yes, go ahead. And if you could just announce your name and speak loudly, because this is the only microphone that the panelists not in the room can hear it from.
Thank you. My name is Richard Hiskus. I'm a professor emeritus of human rights at the University of Connecticut. First of all, thank you to all the speakers for a wonderful conversation today. And my question is really about something that you all said that I almost never hear said about 9/11. Beginning with the first speaker, that we called 9/11 an egregious assault on human rights. George Bush called it a cowardly act. He called it an attack on the homeland, which is kind of disturbing. I never heard our country referred to as the homeland before that. Rather than calling it the fatherland, I guess, but still, it's kind of bizarre. How important do you think it is to characterize an event like 9/11 for what it is, as an egregious violation of human rights, in order to prevent the legacy of the response to that egregious violation of human rights to be more egregious violations of human rights? Assault on Americans' rights of privacy, embrace of torture officially for the first time in our country's history, starting a war that really had nothing to do with 9/11. And also, this is particularly what the first speaker talked about, a reluctance to acknowledge that the victims of 9/11 had their rights violated, their human rights violated, and therefore, of course, were entitled to reparations, lots of other things. So I guess my question is, do we ever get around, do you think we'll ever get around to talking about events like 9/11 as being what they are? They are not attacks on the homeland. They are egregious violations of human rights. If we do, will that make sense?
Okay, so Andrea and Fanula, were you able to hear the question? Yes, both. Okay, so that's about the sort of framing of 9/11 as a human rights violation and the effect of that on the response. Which of you would like to? I can't. You can just raise your hand. Okay, go ahead. You want to go first? Maybe all three of you want to respond to that, but go ahead, Andrea.
I'll just jump in because I don't actually think I said that 9/11 was a violation of human rights, because I don't believe that it was. I think it was a horrific crime. And I think that I should note too, I work with a number of family members of victims of 9/11, and we work jointly seeking justice and accountability. There are a number of family members who vehemently oppose the military commission system and are really outraged at the human rights violations and crimes that were committed ostensibly in their name, and are really great partners on a number of advocacy issues that I work on. And I think that it hurts people a great deal to hear someone say that it wasn't a human rights violation. And for we look at the law and say, but this is what it is. I mean, states have a international legal responsibility, and the human rights obligations are on the state. So in my view, there was not an international human rights violation by 9/11. It was a criminal act. The subsequent conduct by states is a human rights violation, but that doesn't mean that people should not be remembered, should not receive some form of reparations, should not have any number of responses that recognize the horrible crime that occurred. I just don't think that the language of international human rights law is the right language for that, because the system is designed to address primarily state responsibility or responsibility by non-state actors at the time, I don't think Al-Qaeda was a non-state actor that had a human rights obligation in that context. But I will let the real legal experts answer that in more detail.
I think maybe all three of you want to respond. I'm sensing from some body language. So Fionnuala, would you like to respond on this issue about?
Sure. I mean, I don't tend to get, I mean, although sometimes we have to be very precise, but I think I'd be very clear. This, to me, this was a crime against humanity. It meets that threshold of egregiousness. We know as sort of from the doctrine of what that means, that it would hold individuals accountable for that kind. We have a system of norms that holds individuals accountable. I think as you know, the human rights paradigms have shifted to not only hold states accountable for human rights violations, but we work, I think both Karima and I and many of our colleagues in the UN system work around norms that also recognize the applicability of international human rights law norms to non-state actors, whether that's corporations or non-state actor groups. And so in that frame, I think it would be also appropriate. I would not be uncomfortable calling this within a human rights paradigm. And I think the reason why that's important is in either way of naming it, the key question is not only accountability, but what kind of status and acknowledgement it gives to the victims of terrorism, the victims of the crime. And in most systems, whether it's a crime against humanity or a human rights violation, the systems that support victims are incredibly poor. Karima is absolutely right. I mean, states invariably, and I know this from my own work with states, will always have great solidarity and commitment, but try to get them on setting up an actual system of support, putting in place health, medical, including psychosocial support to victims. And they're running out of the room ahead of you faster than you to make the doors. So I think just on the nomenclatures, I think both are appropriate. Some human rights bodies are less comfortable using the terminology of human rights for non-state actors, some more. But I think it certainly falls into the crime against humanity box. So Karima may have more to add on that.
So thanks, Fionnuala. Karima?
Thank you very much for this important question, because I think that you're right. I think the language that we use to describe the crime also helps us shape what the appropriate response should be. And I don't think we've often enough used the language of human rights here. So the classical approach to human rights was that only states have human rights obligations. Human rights is about controlling state power. And coercive uses of state power. But I think we learned from feminists, we learned from advocates for human rights in the private sector that there are other forms of coercive power that also need to be tempered and constrained by human rights. So while it is largely true to say that most human rights treaty obligations only apply to the state parties, but there's even been some interesting blurring around that when non-state actors control that territory. For me, it's incorrect and an old-fashioned approach to say that non-state actors cannot violate human rights. When I worked in the legal office of Amnesty International in the 90s, we were told that we couldn't use the dreaded V word, violation, with a non-state actor. We had to say abuse. And that to me was always a bit of a euphemism, especially when we were talking to victims. And so I think one has to be careful about the implications of calling it a human rights violation, and there are multiple ways of looking at that. One can address the human rights violation by the non-state perpetrator, but there's also the issue that was raised in Ben Emerson's report that I mentioned about the failures of the state to prevent the violations of the right to life by the citizens and so on, which is also a critical, citizens and non-citizens, which is also a critical component of the human rights approach to this. To me, ultimately, the best response to 9/11 is a response that reaffirms the universality of human rights, which is, in addition to the attack on human beings, I think what the attacks were really aimed at. And I think bringing the crime itself into the sphere of human rights is a very important way of pushing back against that. And indeed, I think one of the many horrific aspects of the use of torture in the post 9/11 context was that too was really a way of shredding the commitment to universal human rights. And for me, the reason that terrorism is so appalling is it is about instrumentalizing the intentional infliction of severe suffering. And I am convinced by the jurist Antonio Prasso that there actually is a core consensus definition of terrorism, even if not all states have agreed around those dimensions. And the so-called enhanced interrogation program really was about that same view, that you can instrumentalize, deliberately causing pain to other human beings. And I wrote a piece called Terror Torture that looks at this. So I think if we want to strengthen the values of the protection of human dignity and human life, that means both combating torture and terrorism with equal firmness.
Okay, thank you very much, all three, for thanks for the question, thanks for the answers. So there's a number of questions, and there's a couple that I can actually combine from first. The first questioner with the similar question is Islam Jafal, a grad student here in Michigan, and the second is from Tom Temprosa, who is a graduate student in the law school, my student who's in the Philippines. And they both ask about the implications of the lack of a single definition of terrorism. Islam is concerned about, Islam Jafal, the grad student here, is interested about how that's influenced US relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran, and whether certain definitions are invoked or ignored. Tom is interested in whether the lack of definition constrains the ability of human rights law to make a difference, because we don't really know what human rights law is supposed to respond to. So I guess I'll start with Fionnuala on that question, since you actually talked about that, and about the implications both politically and for human rights law of not having an agreed definition. How does it matter?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm taking a bit of a shortcut by saying there's no definition. We do have 19 sectoral treaties on counterterrorism, which include highly specific regulation of acts of terrorism. There is one UN Security Council resolution, 1563, if I'm getting the number right, which has a short definition, a working definition of terrorism. And of course, there's the model definition of terrorism, which was offered by the first mandate holder, Martin Scheinen, which focuses on really trying to take that sort of core consensus that we see across multiple treaty systems and, IHL plus these sectoral treaties. So I think we don't have a multilateral treaty on terrorism. But we don't lack, I think, the guidance to tell states when they're acting outside of the parameters. And of course, that's the sort of work of the mandate I hold in a daily way, which is looking at state practice and telling them whether they're within or without those margins. But I think it has been highly politically convenient for states not to have a multilateral treaty and to say, oh, well, because we're tied up in the Sixth Committee, we just can't do, we get to do what we want domestically. And the corollary of that has been the absence of any meaningful monitoring and assessment of state practice on terrorism. Because frankly, one of the things we know is that while in theory, universal periodic review and human rights reporting can serve that function in some elongated way down the road, it doesn't really work for the day-to-day practice of states in the terrorism space. And one of the challenges I think we see is that we have two focal points. We have Geneva and we have New York. Geneva does this review, UPR, but states know that in New York, at the Security Council, they have a permissive environment. So if you get to choose between which of those two places you're going to worry about how you're behaving, you know that if you're not being called to account in the security space by the Counterterrorism Committee, by the reporting requirement, that you sort of get to do an a la carte menu on compliance in the terrorism arena. And so I think that is a weakness of international legal oversight, not least because the scale of the human rights violations that we're seeing promulgated by counterterrorism and security in national systems is so broad. And so I do think we can do better. And it's not by lack of a definition, but it's by lack of the will of states to enforce the definitions they have in a rigorous and sustained way.
Okay, thanks. Let's go back to the room. Maybe one of the students would like to ask a question. I've got two hands. We'll start over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lena. I'm an international studies major here at Michigan. My question is kind of along the lines of reparation and justice and even just acknowledgement of victims of terrorism. Obviously, in the last couple of years, I believe it was 2 summers ago, finally we had some success in ensuring that the benefits for first responders on 9/11 would be protected permanently. But I don't know, and I'm kind of curious to have your opinions on whether legally that's the way to do it worldwide to ensure legal benefits, or just work on first increasing public awareness that they're victims of terrorism beyond America on 9/11 and beyond some of the more publicized events. So whether there's a legal route or a more PR route, that would be what I'm curious about.
Okay, so were the two of you able to hear the question? Yes, okay, so about reparations for victims of terrorism and for counterterrorism for both, yes, okay, so since Karima, you started talking about reparations, you want to get us started on that?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. So I think it has been such an important development that the Victims' Compensation Fund in the United States was extended. I think it's quite surprising when we think that there was a question as to whether or not that was actually going to happen. And at one point, the fund had run out of money, and there was a great deal of worry about what compensation would be available. But now it has been extended so that I believe it's for another 70 years or so, in fact, that claims can be made from the fund. And I think that that's a very positive development. I think there are a number of aspects of this that we need to consider. So there's the issue of compensation. There's also the issue of the right to be heard, including in the context of criminal proceedings against perpetrators. This is something, again, that Ben Emerson in the report on the human rights of victims of terrorism emphasized. And we're seeing some interesting examples of this in France around the Charlie Hebdo trial, and also now the trial of the perpetrators of the Paris attacks, the ability of victims to have an opportunity to be heard in the course of the proceedings, although I'm sure that that's also a very traumatic experience for them, and not everyone would necessarily choose to do that. I think the big question is what happens for victims in contexts where none of this is possible, where there are simply not going to be trials, where compensation is not available either due to lack of resources or a complete lack of political will. And I've seen this happen with a number of groups of victims of terrorism in a variety of contexts. And that's where I think we need much more action at the global level to offer those remedies.
Thanks. Andrea or Fionnuala, on the issue of reparations, either of you want to add anything on this? Okay.
I was just going to add, Steve, that one of the really big shifts that Karima's last comment alludes to is the need to move in international legal language to seeing victims of terrorism as rights holders, that they are treated as having a rights-based framework dominating states' approaches. We do have a really good and recent General Assembly resolution on victims of terrorism, which actually makes significant strides in that direction. And the most recent global counterterrorism strategy negotiated this June also has much better language. And right now there's a major project being led by the Inter-Parliamentary Union with a number of other stakeholders on putting together model legislative provisions for victims of terrorism that can be used in multiple national legal contexts. So I think this is actually one of the areas where below the surface, we're seeing a lot of work being done to try to support national legal systems. And the last point here is just to say that in the places where the help for victims of terrorism is most needed, if we look at overall casualty rates for victims on the Global Counterterrorism Index, the 5 leading countries, which include Afghanistan, Nigeria, and These are the countries with the poorest infrastructure and the least capacity to deliver. And so the gap can't be made up by those countries. It will require international assistance and support and the willingness of states to pay for those provisions in countries that have weak or inadequate infrastructures.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to take it from Lauren, law student. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So my question is essentially, you've all acknowledged the human rights abuses are large post 9/11, and what mechanism of national or international law can we use to hold governments accountable for these actions? In recognition of how much politics and global power influence the ability of people to hold governments accountable, like on an international stage. There's all the conflict with the ICC situation in Afghanistan, and really just, are we stuck with PR campaigns, or do we have a viable legal mechanism to hold governments accountable?
Maybe we can hear from all three as our final response. Andrea, do you want to tackle that one about whether we can do better in terms of mechanisms for accountability of states at a global level?
Sure. There are many, but I'm not going to list them because all of them hinge on political will. And so the answer is not, it's not PR, but it's about people being willing to demand more. And of course, in a democracy, there's a greater ability to do that. So I'm talking primarily about the US. There has simply not been enough political will, which is not to say people have been silent, but it has not succeeded in changing government conduct. Some of that, I think, is based on what I outlined, the initial period based on fear, and then there was secrecy. We didn't actually know what was happening for a long time. So people know, we know most of what's out there. There are probably some things we don't know, but we know. It's up to voters to decide what they consider to be a priority and to demand from their own government. And this, of course, there are many democracies around the world where this can be happening. And then all of the actual mechanisms in place can be strengthened and utilized, but only if people are willing to actually use them.
Thank you. Fionnuala, on the issue of international mechanisms for accountability and how to improve them?
Well, I think it's hard. That's what I would say. We're in a very, very tough environment. I think one of the big challenges post-Afghanistan is we're going to see terrorism 3.0 being launched. We're seeing it already in the language that's coming out of the US government and other places. We're going to see, I think, a reworking, and so accountability gets harder. But what I will say we need is a serious pruning of the global counterterrorism architecture. That would be a good place to start. That's not accountability in the traditional sense, but it is about oversight. We also need full-time independent oversight of the UN and other counterterrorism architectures. And we got really close to delivering that in the last global counterterrorism strategy. We were 2 days and 2 nights away from the final agreement on that strategy when we lost the ombudsman oversight mechanism in the global counterterrorism architecture. But I believe we can get that kind of independent oversight, which would help hold the UN and other state actors working with the UN accountable for their counterterrorism work, including the human rights violations that follow. The third thing I think we could do that would help is implementing a due diligence policy for states when they operate under the guise of with international organizations. And that sounds pedantic, but it often can be far more effective in ensuring that the design, the delivery, and the oversight of counterterrorism or countering violent extremism, which we haven't talked about, but that's a huge and problematic area of similar scale and magnitude. So I think there are fixes. It's not going to be a lot of trials. It's not likely to be, but I think it's looking for those institutional and normative fixes, clawing back counterterrorism from soft law and the Security Council would be part of that oversight that we could exercise, allowing states their traditional give and take capacity to agree norms in ways that has the consensus of the globe, not just the consensus of the 5+10.
Thank you very much, Karima.
So just to come in briefly, I'm so glad that we're ending with this essential question about accountability. There has clearly been insufficient accountability for the 9/11 attacks themselves, as well as insufficient accountability for the abuses as part of the counterterrorism response. And we have to address this for human rights to be meaningful in this context going forward. I can tell you that when I was interviewing Muslims and people of Muslim heritage around the world working against extremism or had been victims of terrorism, a great deal of the accountability that they wanted was from states that had funded projects and all sorts of initiatives that had given rise to the ideology that caused the terrorism in their view. And they very much, and I heard this from people in Pakistan, in northern Mali, and many other contexts, they wanted to see accountability for some of the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, that they saw as having been responsible for funding many of these groups over the years. And I think that that's a critical piece of the issue that we need to think about. But I would say this, I would throw the accountability question back to our next generation of human rights lawyers here in the room, because this is no longer a question for others. It is a question we need you to help us solve, to create the mechanisms for accountability that we don't have yet and that we need, and to make sure that we use effectively those that already exist.
Thank you so much. And I want to just once again express my thanks to Karima, to Fionnuala, to Andrea for a great hour and a half discussion, really probing this question and pushing back at some of the easy answers to discover just how hard this question really is in some ways, and yet morally in some ways very straightforward. I'd just like to conclude by, to those of you in the room, we are having refreshments outside after this. To the audience as a whole, most of you actually online have stayed the whole time, and I really appreciate that. That's not always easy to do. Our next event in the speaker series is going to be on Wednesday, October the 13th, on challenges to accountability for human rights atrocities in Syria. We'll be hearing from Mohammed Al-Abdallah, who's the founder and director of the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. And that will also be here in person, probably at our normal place over in Weiser Hall. But until then, we appreciate everybody's coming today, both virtually and in person, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. So thanks very much.